As someone who is not that involved in traditional social media, I see it differently than those who use them regularly. Social media, to me, extends far beyond the traditional platforms that we think of. One that I consider to be important, but that we don't tend to perceive as a social media, is music streaming platforms, specifically Spotify. The situation with Spotify, though, is that it acting as a social media platform is changing the industry, and streaming services in general are drastically changing the music industry and actually have already irreparably restructured the way musicians work and the way listeners consume music and view the industry. This becomes important in the way we look not only at music and streaming services, but also at social media platforms and the larger music industry. This is important to anyone who listens to music, and especially those who use music streaming services such as Spotify. This cultural change is important to me not only because I love music, but also because I use Spotify and believe that music should be a social practice. The direction these platforms are heading will impact the social nature of them and the industry. It should also matter to anyone who uses these streaming services, and in fact anyone who enjoys music, because this even affects live performances as well as digital streaming and downloading. We are currently in a strange moment in history, generally speaking, and this is largely due to digital technologies. While this generation consumes content differently than any prior generations, it has also allowed there to be an astounding number of musicians who can pursue their craft. This is important in determining the direction we are headed with regard to music. Not only does Spotify have the ability to share music picks and albums on Facebook, Twitter, and a few other places, it has its own social functions integrated within the app itself. This means that Spotify really can act as a standalone social media platform. People can share their own playlist publicly, and you can see what other people are currently listening to. And you can add friends that share your taste. Now, this can be accomplished through Facebook, but it doesn't have to be and can be used in isolation of other social media. In fact, it often is. We are returning to music as a social exercise. Music began as a social undertaking in its earliest forms, but gradually became more individualistic within the last century or so. With inventions like headphones and personal digitized music players, people could download and listen to their own music on their own for the first time. But invention also brought back a social aspect of music. With improved speaker systems, concerts can become bigger or more intimate, depending on need. This is also true of social media, where people can share music with their friends online. Spotify has the most robust social media functions, both internally and through sharing between other sites. Pandora has a few of these, but the way the app is structured, users have much more limited social options. Spotify is leading this trend. Other music streaming services are pretty much in the same boat as Pandora. Most have a very similar UI and similar social options, if any at all. The music industry has changed a lot since its inception. We'll start with a brief history. Thomas Edison invented, or more likely stole, the idea of a wax cylinder that recorded sound pressure through etching, and this was quickly followed by the phonograph. This was the earliest recording format, and a series of improved recording and playback techniques followed, like tube to transistor microphones and magnetic tape to digital copies. Once digital copies came into popularity, companies figured out that they could buy bulk licenses to use and put up online for non-downloadable use. This alternative to downloading became the best option, and that's where we are today: legal online music streaming. How musicians make their money, though, is something that listeners tend not to think about. General estimates for how much money an artist takes home is, well, bleak. On average, artists take home about 12% across all distribution platforms, just 3% on CD sales, and 0.6 for each play on a streaming service, according to Rolling Stone. The way Spotify in particular pays artists has been hotly debated, and still is, but the common theme here is that artists receive less and less as technology improves. Interestingly, the consumers are far better off financially as the formats become more accessible. While single albums on a CD or vinyl cost $20 or more, you can get a Spotify subscription, essentially all the music you could ever want, for just $10. For bigger names, streaming still means a fair amount of monetary gain, especially because of the way Spotify is currently structured. If an artist has, say, 1% of the total plays on Spotify, then they receive 1% of all subscriber revenue. Sounds fair, but many argue that it favors bigger artists. If a Spotify user only listens to one smaller artist, then more of that individual user's money that it pays to Spotify should go to that one artist, instead of going to artists they never listen to. Simply put, it should be decentralized in that it distributes money to artists based on individual listens from individual users. It makes more sense, as the total revenue from Spotify is not first pooled and redistributed. It is more equal, and it is better for smaller artists financially. I want to talk about artists that chose not to put up their work on Spotify, at least not at first. Taylor Swift is the most common example of this. Although she has since allowed some of her music to be put up on Spotify, she was against it from the start. I don't really listen to Taylor Swift, but I have to give her credit. Not only did she stick to her guns and left her music off the platform, she also has kept up with the musical trends of the industry for years to stay relevant, and with impressive success. Anyway, her stance is that she is not in it for her own personal monetary gain, but that music in general is an art form that should be paid for. People getting access to this music for next to nothing was against what she believed in, but she had to fold this stance to an extent due to the somewhat unstoppable tide of streaming that's taking over, or already has taken over, the music industry. I also want to talk briefly about the Spotify charts. The US charts are pretty much the same as the global charts, which I think is partly due to many of the artists that are on here are American, but also that the internet has connected the world in ways unheard of mere years ago. Streaming and social functions within music apps is also a large part of this. Songs are now becoming viral because of online sharing and suggestions, and what Spotify decides is popular. One last point in this section: artificial intelligence and the use of neural networks as applied to music streaming services. Now, neural networks are dumb. They're not aware of their function, they just make a decision based on training that a human has to help with. Usually, neural networks are designed around problems with concrete answers, such as analyzing human handwriting. But with choosing songs and artists as a suggestion on Spotify is not necessarily a right answer. Taste will never be absolute. So, the program used by Spotify and other streaming services makes song and artist suggestions. Some of these put greater stock in bigger names in music, and so these music streaming services always nudge listeners to more popular artists. Spotify is pretty good about giving artist suggestions that match what the user listens to. The fans also listen to section of Spotify is also decent at giving artists of the same magnitude as suggestions. Next, we'll look at why this matters and how music streaming as social media is related to and affects the music industry. The social media functions of these music streaming apps is a large part of the direction the music industry is taking. As evidenced by the Spotify charts, popular music becomes globalized, and this is almost entirely due to the internet and social media. This is a positive consequence of this social streaming integration, but there are equal negative consequences. Music artists can become astronomically big, and with more musicians than ever before, it is very hard for smaller names to really make it anywhere. This is because of something I'd like to call the fame gap. In the 60s, 4 friends from Liverpool became bigger than Jesus, in the immortal words of one of those friends. That group was known as the Beatles. They were the dawn of the true musician celebrity. By the end of their career, the Beatles didn't even need to play music for people to just break down and cry. All it took was the sight of them, and people lost it, just because of who they were. Now compare this to a modern artist, say Billie Eilish, who achieved an insane amount of fame before she even turned 18. This is because there are so many musicians out there that when someone does something so different at such a young age, people notice. Additionally, with so many musicians, something like this seems predictable. Just thinking about it statistically, you'd expect something like this to happen eventually. I'm not saying putting musicians on a pedestal is bad, nor that a saturation of musical artists is bad, but attaining celebrity status when combined with too many musicians inevitably causes a gap between the huge and the nobodies. This fame gap becomes further amplified, and may have even been partly caused by social media and streaming services. I used to think Spotify was helping to cause this phenomenon, but actually I learned that it is constantly trying to promote small or upcoming artists. I always thought that the suggestions always led toward bigger names, but that's not entirely true. You know that game where you would go to a random page on Wikipedia and just through clicking links try to get to the page for Jesus or Kevin Bacon? I tried to do that with Spotify and the Beatles. I went to a random page and just through the fans also listen to and artist appears on section of each page, tried to get to the Beatles Spotify page. I found this to be very difficult, as I would just get caught in loops of artists I've never heard of. And this is to Spotify's credit. If you listen to small artists, it tends to suggest equally small artists. This game also might work with more current artists who have made the charts in the past few years, like Post Malone or Travis Scott, but it's still tough. I never had that experience with Pandora, as local bands would always lead to big names. Granted, I haven't used Pandora in years, and it has certainly changed a lot since then. So what I've seen through this is that music streaming services are getting better and trying to remedy this, even if they don't realize it. I've noticed a trend in social media recently that I think will continue. Many traditional social media sites have begun to converge. Most modern social media have the same functionality as all the others. Snapchat, Facebook, and Instagram all pretty much have the same features. This is partly due to these companies buying each other up, but it also has to do with trends. It seems one day there might be one single all-purpose app that does everything from music and video streaming to social media and online shopping to whatever else we might need in the future. This may seem like an extreme digital utopianism, but it's not outside the realm of possibility in today's world. This ultimate integration will further both the negatives and positives of social media with respect to music streaming. The future will be simplified in one way or another, and the music industry will have to adapt accordingly. So, why does this matter? Does it matter? What can we do about this? Can we do anything about this? This matters because as social media converges, music may similarly converge. Doesn't it seem like a lot of the most popular music sounds very similar to each other? I wish people would expand their tastes, but that's just not how it works. This is an important issue to me because I want there to be a wider range of music that's considered popular. I want the charts to be more diverse in genre. Everyone should want their favorite style to hit the charts, but since everyone seems to already listen to the same thing, this becomes kind of a moot point. So what can we do about this? The first option to fix this fame gap is to support small local artists. Seems obvious, but popular music becomes popular for a reason, and those big artists are widely respected. It is hard to make it as a musician, but there is so much good music out there, even in the smallest of venues. I think radio is part of the problem as well, since most everything that's played on the radio these days is just everything on the charts. Since radio stations have to keep up with what's popular or else they die out, it's not their fault. People need to seek out new music from small artists, and that's hard to do when there is good music served directly to audiences straight from big names. Once you find a local artist you like, this is where social media becomes important. These artists need to be shared to make it anywhere, or else they would get lost in a sea of other similar musicians. If a small artist is lucky enough to make it big, then find other local artists. The gap must be closed. It's important just to be aware of this so you think about the musicians themselves and not just their work. Small artists are people just like the huge celebrities and should be treated equally. On the streaming side, there should be mechanisms in place to advocate for these good, smaller artists. It should promote social media usage when you find a small artist that you like and push the option to share these artists, and not push sharing bigger artists. There should be incentives for sharing new music discoveries on social media. This seems lateral, but anything might help remedy these problems. So what have we learned? Well, the functionality of apps that are as innocuous and one-sided as Spotify are increasing. With social media a constant presence, this becomes important to stay aware of. And even those who don't use the social functions of these streaming apps or social media at all will be affected by this. Your online presence is changing the music industry whether you realize it or not. And it's not just music either. The internet and social media are affecting pretty much all large industries constantly. It's difficult to think of industries that aren't affected by digital technologies. The real takeaway for us, though, is that the music industry and social media is changing. If you listen to music or use social media, you should be aware of this. Social media might affect how we think of music in the future, and I'd say it already has.